The Texas sun hung low and merciless in the western sky, casting long shadows across the dusty main street of Perdition Creek, a town that had earned its ominous name through decades of violence, corruption, and moral decay. It was the kind of place where decent people locked their doors at sunset and prayed for dawn, where the law was whatever the strongest man said it was, and where children learned early that survival meant staying invisible to the predators who ruled the night. The year was 1889, and the frontier was supposedly civilizing itself. But towns like Perdition Creek remained, pockets of lawlessness where the old ways died hard and the new ones hadn't yet taken root. Into this hellscape rode a man who went by the name of Cain, though whether that was his given name or one he'd chosen for its biblical implications, nobody knew and nobody dared ask. At 55, Cain was a living legend, a gunfighter whose reputation had been carved in blood across 3 decades of frontier violence. His weathered face bore the permanent squint lines of someone who'd spent half a lifetime watching for enemies, and his pale gray eyes held the cold emptiness of a man who'd killed so often that death had become just another tool of his trade. He rode into Perdition Creek on a black gelding named Judgment, his twin Colt point for 5 seconds, riding low on his hips, and his Winchester rifle prominently displayed in its saddle scabbard. Everything about Cain's appearance was calculated to send a message. He was death incarnate, a man to be feared and avoided at all costs. The townspeople who glimpsed him from behind their curtained windows crossed themselves and whispered prayers, hoping he was just passing through and wouldn't find reason to demonstrate the skills that had made him infamous throughout the territories. Cain had come to Perdition Creek following rumors of a man named Black Jack Morrison, a fellow gunfighter with whom he had unfinished business dating back to the end of the Civil War. Morrison had supposedly taken control of the town's criminal enterprises, using fear and brutality to maintain his grip on the lucrative trade in stolen cattle, smuggled weapons, and human misery that sustained places like Perdition Creek. It was personal business, the kind that could only be settled with blood, and Cain had been tracking Morrison for 3 years across half the American West. He was riding slowly down the main street, his eyes scanning every doorway and alley for signs of potential ambush, when he saw her, a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, kneeling in the dust beside the boardwalk outside Murphy's General Store. She was crying not the loud, attention-seeking wails of a child having a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken sobs of someone who had learned that crying brought no comfort, no rescue, no relief from whatever pain had driven her to this public display of despair. The child was dressed in a simple calico dress that had once been blue but was now faded to the color of old pewter, torn at the hem and stained with dust and what might have been dried blood. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her thin face, and her bare feet were cut and bruised from walking on rough ground without shoes. She clutched a small cloth doll to her chest, its fabric as worn and dirty as her own clothing, its button eyes hanging loose from threads that had seen too much handling. Around her in the dust were the clear impressions of many boots and horseshoes, evidence that numerous people had passed by this spot without stopping to help or even acknowledge her presence. Perdition Creek was the kind of town where human suffering was so commonplace that it had become invisible, where stepping over broken bodies and broken spirits was just part of daily life. But something about this particular scene, the tiny figure kneeling in the dirt, abandoned by a world that should have protected her, cut through Cain's carefully maintained emotional armor, like a blade finding the gap between steel plates. Cain drew his horse to a halt beside the weeping child, his shadow falling across her small form like a dark blessing. The little girl looked up at him with eyes that were far too old for her young face, eyes that had seen things no child should ever witness. They were brown like desert stones, but they held depths of pain and loss that made Cain's chest tighten, with an emotion he'd thought buried decades ago. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other, the legendary gunfighter and the abandoned child, separated by 49 years of age and a lifetime of experience, but connected by something indefinable that transcended their differences. Cain saw in her eyes the same emptiness he recognized in his own mirror, the hollow look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and found themselves alone in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. "What's your name, little one?" Cain asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. The question seemed to surprise the child, as if she'd grown unaccustomed to being addressed as a human being rather than an obstacle to be stepped around. "Lily," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and thirst. Lily, Morningstar. The surname meant nothing to Cain, but he noted the way she pronounced it with a pride that survived despite her obvious destitution. This was a child who remembered better times, who still carried within her the echo of a life when her name had meant something more than just another casualty of frontier brutality. "Where are your parents, Lily Morningstar?" Cain asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the defeated way she held herself. "Dead," she replied simply, the word carrying a finality that spoke of recent and traumatic loss. "The bad men came 3 days ago. They burned our house and shot Papa and Mama. I hid in the root cellar like Mama told me, but when I came out," she didn't finish the sentence. but Cain could fill in the missing details from decades of experience. With frontier violence, another family destroyed by the casual cruelty that characterized places like Perdition Creek, another set of parents murdered for reasons that probably made sense only to their killers. Without a word, Cain dismounted and approached the child. Slowly, his movements careful and unthreatening despite his intimidating appearance. He knelt in the dust beside her, bringing his weathered face down to her level, and gently reached out to touch her tear-stained cheek. "I'm sorry for your loss, Lily," he said quietly. "Nobody should have to face what you've been through, especially not someone your age." Lily's eyes filled with fresh tears, not of sorrow this time, but of something that might have been relief. In 3 days of wandering through Perdition Creek, she had been ignored, cursed at, and told to move along by dozens of adults. But this frightening-looking stranger was the first person to acknowledge her pain and offer even the smallest measure of compassion. Cain reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a piece of jerky and a small canteen of water. "When did you last eat?" he asked, already knowing from her gaunt appearance that it had been far too long. "Yesterday morning," Lily admitted, accepting the food with the desperate gratitude of someone who had been genuinely hungry. "I found some scraps behind the restaurant, but the cook chased me away before I could finish them." The image of this child scavenging for scraps like a stray dog sent a surge of anger through Cain's chest, a fury directed not at any specific individual but at the entire system of callous indifference that allowed such things to happen. He watched as she devoured the jerky with the mechanical efficiency of survival, washing it down with careful sips of water as if she was afraid he might change his mind and take it away. "What were you planning to do?" Cain asked when she had finished eating. "Where were you going to sleep tonight?" Lily's small shoulders shrugged in a gesture that was heartbreakingly adult in its resignation. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I was hoping someone might let me sleep in their barn, or stable, but everyone just tells me to go away." Cain found himself facing a dilemma that had no easy resolution. For 30 years, he had lived by a simple code: trust no one, form no attachments, and never allow emotions to compromise the cold calculation that had kept him alive through countless gunfights and dangerous situations. Taking responsibility for a 6-year-old child violated every principle he had developed for survival in a world where weakness was a luxury that could get you killed. But looking down at Lily Morningstar's upturned face, seeing the mixture of hope and fear in her brown eyes, Cain felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought had died along with his own family 40 years ago. This child represented everything pure and innocent that still existed in a world that seemed determined to destroy such qualities wherever they could be found. She was a reminder of what he had once fought to protect, before the war had turned into something else entirely. "Come on," he said finally, extending his hand to help her to her feet. "You're coming with me." Lily's eyes widened in surprise and tentative joy. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it," Cain confirmed, though he was already questioning the wisdom of his decision. "But you need to understand something. I'm not a good man, Lily. I've done things that would give you nightmares, and there are people in this town who want me dead. Staying with me might be more dangerous than staying on the street." The child considered this information with the seriousness of someone who had learned to evaluate threats and make survival decisions. "Are you going to hurt me?" she asked. "Directly, no," Cain replied without hesitation. "I will never hurt you, and I won't let anyone else hurt you either. That's a promise." It was a promise that surprised him with its intensity, spoken with a conviction that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. In that moment, Cain realized that he had just committed himself to something that would fundamentally change the trajectory of his life. He had become responsible for another human being's welfare, and that responsibility would take precedence over everything else, including his own survival. He helped Lily up onto Judgment's saddle, settling her in front of him where he could keep her secure, with one arm while maintaining his ability to draw his weapons if necessary. The little girl felt impossibly light and fragile against his chest, a constant reminder of how vulnerable she was and how much she would depend on his protection. "Where are we going?" Lily asked as they rode toward the edge of town. "There's an old line shack about 2 miles north of here," Cain replied. "It's not much, but it's got a roof and walls, and it's far enough from town that we won't be bothered by curious visitors." The line shack was a remnant from the days when this area had been open range, a small cabin used by cowboys to shelter during storms or when working cattle far from the main ranch house. It had been abandoned for years, but Cain had noted its location during his reconnaissance of the area, filing it away as a potential safe house if he needed to go to ground quickly. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Lily gradually relaxed against Cain's chest, her exhaustion finally catching up with her now that she felt safe for the first time in days. The steady rhythm of the horse's movement and the warmth of human contact lulled her into a state somewhere between sleep and waking, her small body going limp with relief. Cain found himself adjusting his posture to better support her weight, an unconscious gesture that spoke to instincts he'd forgotten he possessed. The line shack sat in a small grove of cottonwood trees beside a creek that provided fresh water. Year-round, it was a simple structure, one room, with a stone fireplace, a few pieces of rough furniture, and enough space for 2 people to sleep comfortably. Cain had stayed in far worse places during his years on the trail, and for someone like Lily, who had been sleeping in the dirt, it would seem like luxury. Asterisk, asterisk, as Cain settled Lily into the line shack for the night, wrapping her in his spare blanket, and building a small fire to ward off the chill of the Texas evening, he remained unaware that their movements had been observed by watchers in the hills surrounding Perdition Creek. The men who tracked them were not ordinary bandits or casual opportunists, but members of a highly organized group with resources and connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single town or territory. They had been watching Perdition Creek for days, waiting for the right moment to implement a plan that had been months in the making. The leader of this group was a man known as Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood, though his military title had been earned in private armies and mercenary companies rather than any official government service. Blackwood was 48 years old, tall, and lean, with the kind of cold intelligence that made him far more dangerous than any common outlaw. He commanded a force of 30 hand-picked fighters, men who had been recruited from the ranks of discharged soldiers, failed lawmen, and professional killers who worked for whoever paid them best. What made Blackwood's organization particularly formidable was their method of operation. They didn't simply rob banks or rustle cattle like ordinary criminals, but instead infiltrated entire communities, taking control of local power structures, and extracting wealth through systematic extortion and intimidation. Perdition Creek was their latest target, chosen because of its isolation, its existing criminal infrastructure, and its strategic location along several major smuggling routes. "The girl is with the gunfighter," reported Miguel Santos, Black chief scout, as he returned from observing Cain's movements. "They've taken shelter in the old line shack by Wilson Creek." Blackwood received this information with the calm satisfaction of a man whose careful planning was proceeding exactly as anticipated. "Excellent. How many men does he have with him?" "Just the girl," Santos replied. "No other weapons visible except his personal sidearms and rifle. He appears to be traveling alone." This was better than Blackwood had dared hope. He had been prepared to deal with Cain as part of a larger group, possibly including other gunfighters or hired protection. Fighting a lone man, even one with Cain's reputation, would be significantly easier than engaging a well-organized gang. "What about the town?" Blackwood asked his lieutenant, a scarred ex-cavalry sergeant named Dutch Miller. "Are the preparations complete?" "Everything's in place," Colonel Miller confirmed. "We've got men positioned at every exit from Perdition Creek, and the local sheriff has been persuaded to cooperate with our operations. When you give the word, we can cut all the telegraph lines and control every road in or out of the area." Blackwood smiled, an expression that somehow managed to be both satisfied and predatory. "And the townspeople?" "Scared," Miller replied with obvious satisfaction. "Word's already spreading that something big is going to happen tonight. Most folks are planning to lock their doors and pray it passes them by." The plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. By cutting Perdition Creek off from the outside world and demonstrating their ability to control every aspect of life in the town, Blackwood's organization would establish the kind of psychological dominance that made extended resistance impossible. The townspeople would realize that their previous conception of safety and security had been an illusion, and they would be forced to accept whatever terms Blackwood chose to impose. "The girl is the key to everything," Blackwood explained to his assembled lieutenants as they prepared for the night's operations. "Her real name is Lily Morningstar, but what our friend the gunfighter doesn't know is that she's not just any orphan. She's the daughter of Judge William Morningstar, the federal judge who is supposed to arrive in Austin next week to investigate our operations." The revelation sent murmurs of understanding through the group of hardened criminals. Judge Morningstar had been appointed by the territorial government to conduct a comprehensive investigation of corruption and criminal activity in the border regions, armed with federal warrants and the authority to call in military support if necessary. His arrival would have meant the end of their profitable enterprises and likely resulted in hangings for most of Blackwood's inner circle. As night settled over Perdition Creek like a suffocating blanket, the town's residents began to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with their world. It started with small things, the usual sounds of evening activity from the saloons and gambling houses gradually fading to silence, the gas lamps that illuminated the main street flickering and dying one by one, and an unusual number of riders moving through the shadows at the edge of town. By 10 o'clock, Perdition Creek had been transformed from its usual state of raucous, violent activity to something resembling a ghost town, with frightened residents huddled behind locked doors and shuttered windows. The telegraph office had gone silent without explanation. The sheriff's office was dark and empty, and even the notorious Black Dog Saloon, which normally operated around the clock, had closed its doors and extinguished its lights. Colonel Blackwood had achieved his first objective with ruthless efficiency, cutting the town off from the outside world and establishing psychological control over its population without firing a single shot. In the line shack by Wilson Creek, Cain was beginning to sense that the natural rhythms of the night had been disrupted by human activity. His decades of experience in dangerous situations had honed his instincts to an almost supernatural level of sensitivity. and something in the quality of the silence told him that hostile forces were moving in the darkness around them. The absence of normal night sounds, the calling of owls, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the distant noise from town created an atmosphere of impending threat that set his nerves on edge. "Lily," he said quietly, gently shaking the sleeping child awake, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." The little girl's eyes opened immediately, alert and focused, despite having been in deep sleep moments before. 3 days of survival on the streets had taught her to wait quickly and assess her situation instantly, skills that might save her life before this night was over. "Are the bad men coming?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Cain was struck by her immediate understanding of the situation. This was a child who had learned to read danger in adult faces and voices, who understood that safety was always temporary and threat was always close at hand. "I think they might be," he admitted, seeing no point in lying to someone who clearly had experience with violence and danger. "But I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm going to protect you. That's a promise I made, and I don't break my promises." Lily nodded solemnly, clutching her worn cloth doll closer to her chest. "What do you want me to do?" "There's a root cellar under the floorboards in the corner," Cain said, pointing to a section of the floor that looked slightly different from the rest. "If I tell you to hide, I want you to get down there and stay quiet no matter what you hear happening up here. Can you do that?" "Yes," Lily replied without hesitation. "I hid in a cellar before, when the bad men came to our house. Mama said I was very brave." The mention of her murdered parents sent another surge of protective fury through Cain's chest. This child had already endured more trauma and loss than most adults experienced in a lifetime, and he was determined that she would not suffer any more harm while she was under his protection. He checked his weapons methodically, both Colt .45s loaded with 6 rounds each, the Winchester rifle loaded and ready, and a backup Derringer tucked into his boot. 38 years of gunfighting had taught him the importance of preparation, and the value of having more firepower available than you thought you would need. Outside the line shack, the darkness was complete except for the faint starlight that filtered through the cottonwood trees. Cain could hear nothing unusual, but his instincts screamed that they were being watched by hostile eyes. Somewhere in that darkness, men with weapons were moving into position, preparing to implement whatever plan had brought them to this isolated location. "Remember what I told you?" Cain said to Lily as he moved toward the window to scan the surrounding area. "When I say hide, you get in that cellar and you stay there until I come get you." "I remember," Lily said, her voice carrying a courage that amazed him. "Are you scared?" "Yes," Cain admitted honestly. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't. Be brave. Sometimes being brave means doing what you have to do, even when you're scared." The attack came at midnight with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Colonel Blackwood had positioned his 30 men in a wide circle around the line shack, using the darkness and natural cover to move within striking distance without being detected. His plan was not to simply kill Cain and take the girl, that would have been relatively easy given their overwhelming numerical advantage, but to demonstrate the futility of resistance and extract maximum psychological impact from the encounter. "Light them up," Blackwood commanded from his position in the trees 100 yards from the cabin. Instantly, a dozen torches flared to life around the perimeter, illuminating the line shack and revealing the hopelessness of Cain's tactical situation. The ring of armed men stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction, their weapons trained on the small cabin where the legendary gunfighter had thought to find safety. Cain Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the distance, amplified by a speaking trumpet that added a theatrical quality to the confrontation. "I am Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood, and you are completely surrounded by 30 of the finest fighting men in the territory. I'm prepared to discuss terms for your surrender and the release of the child." Inside the cabin, Cain felt a familiar calm descend over him, the same icy composure that had carried him through countless life-and-death situations over the decades. Fear was still there, but it was controlled and channeled into the kind of heightened awareness that made ordinary men capable of extraordinary things. "Hide," he said quietly to Lily, and the little girl immediately scrambled toward the corner where the hidden root cellar waited. "Cain," Blackwood called again. "I know you can hear me. Come out with your hands visible, and we can discuss this." Like civilized men, the gunfighter moved to the window and called back, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced death so many times that it held no particular terror for him. "I'm listening." "Colonel, what do you want?" The child, Blackwood replied without hesitation. "Nothing more, nothing less. Turn over the girl, and you're free to ride out of here with no further interference from my organization." Cain felt pieces of the puzzle clicking together in his mind. This wasn't a random kidnapping or a crime of opportunity. These men had come specifically for Lily, which meant she was far more important than he had realized. "What's so special about one little orphan girl?" he called back. "Special enough to bring 30 men out here in the middle of the night." Blackwood's laughter carried a note of genuine amusement. "Oh, Mr. Cain, you really don't know, do you? That little orphan girl is Lily Morningstar, daughter of Federal Judge William Morningstar, the same judge who was supposed to arrive in Austin next week to investigate certain business operations in this region." The revelation hit Cain like a physical blow. Lily wasn't just any child, she was the daughter of a federal judge, which meant her parents hadn't been killed by random bandits, but murdered as part of a larger conspiracy to prevent judicial investigation of criminal activity. Taking her hadn't been an act of compassion, it had been an act of war against organized crime. Her father's dead, Cain replied, stalling for time while he processed the implications of what he'd learned. Killed 3 days ago, along with her mother, indeed, Blackwood confirmed. A tragic necessity, I'm afraid. Judge Morningstar was proving inconvenient to certain business interests, but his daughter represents a valuable asset leverage against the federal government's continued interest in our affairs. The colonel's voice took on a more threatening tone. She's worth far more to me alive than dead, Mr. Cain, but I'm perfectly willing to kill everyone in that cabin, if you force my hand. You have 5 minutes to decide: surrender the girl and live, or die, defending someone who was doomed from the moment her father accepted his appointment. Cain closed his eyes and tried to think clearly through the rage that threatened to cloud his judgment. Lily Morningstar wasn't just an innocent child who had lost her parents. She was a target of a criminal conspiracy that stretched from local criminals to federal politics. Protecting her meant standing against forces far larger and more dangerous than anything he had faced in 30 years of gunfighting. From her hiding place in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, Lily could hear the muffled voices of the men outside, though she couldn't make out the specific words being exchanged. The wooden planks above her head seemed impossibly thin, offering little protection from the violence she knew was coming. She clutched her worn cloth doll tighter and tried to be brave like her mama had taught her. But the familiar sounds of angry men with weapons brought back memories of the night her parents had died. 3 days ago, she had hidden in a similar cellar while strangers had destroyed everything she loved, and now history seemed to be repeating itself with terrifying precision. Above her, Cain was making calculations that went far beyond simple tactical considerations. 30 armed men against one represented impossible odds by any conventional measure, but conventional measures had never applied to his particular skill set. He had survived 3 decades of frontier violence, not through superior numbers or better equipment, but through superior preparation, ruthless efficiency, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat as an option. The line shack offered certain defensive advantages: thick log walls that would stop most rifle rounds, limited points of entry that could be defended by a single man, and a clear field of fire in all directions. More importantly, Blackwood's men were spread thin around a wide perimeter, which meant they couldn't bring their full firepower to bear simultaneously. If Cain could force them to attack in smaller groups, he might be able to even the odds through superior marksmanship and tactical positioning. Time's running out, Cain, Blackwood called. 2 minutes left. Are you going to be reasonable, or do I need to demonstrate what 30 rifles can do to that little cabin? Instead of answering, Cain began his preparations for what he knew would be his final battle. He moved furniture to create additional cover, checked his ammunition supply one more time, and positioned himself where he could cover both the door and the single window that provided access to the cabin's interior. In gunfighting, he had learned that survival depended not on avoiding death, but on ensuring that your death served a purpose worth dying for. Lily, he called softly toward the hidden cellar. Can you hear me? Yes, came the whispered reply from beneath the floorboards. I want you to know something, Cain said, his voice carrying a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence. He was preparing to unleash whatever happens tonight. You are not alone. There are people in this world who will fight for you, who will die for you if necessary, just because you deserve to be protected. Remember that. Are you going to die? Lily asked with the direct honesty of a child who had already learned too much about mortality. Maybe, Cain admitted, but if I do, it won't be for nothing. It will be for you, and for everyone else who deserves better than what men like Blackwood want to give them. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, a promise and a benediction that transcended the immediate circumstances of their situation. Cain had spent 30 years running from his past, trying to escape the guilt and pain of things he had done and people he had failed to save, but in this moment, facing impossible odds to protect an innocent child, he finally found a purpose that justified all the violence and death that had defined his life. Time's up. Blackwood's voice carried a note of finality that sent a chill through the night air. Boys, light up that cabin. Show Mr. Cain what happens to people who don't know when they're beaten. The first volley of rifle fire erupted from the darkness like thunder, 30 weapons firing simultaneously and sending a storm of lead crashing into the log walls of the line shack. Splinters of wood exploded through the interior as bullets found gaps between the logs, and the noise was deafening in the confined space. But Cain was already moving, rolling from his position behind an overturned table to a new location near the window, his Winchester rifle ready to return fire. The battle that followed would be remembered in the territory for decades to come because of its scale, which was relatively modest by frontier standards, but because of what it represented, one man's refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. fighting not for glory or profit, but for the simple principle that some things were worth dying for. Cain's first shot took down the man holding the speaking trumpet, a carefully aimed round that demonstrated his legendary marksmanship even under extreme duress. His second and third shots found targets among the torchbearers, extinguishing two of the lights that had been illuminating his position and restoring some tactical advantage to his defensive position. "Spread out," Blackwood commanded, his voice carrying clearly despite the loss of his amplification device. "Don't bunch up. He can't shoot all of us." But Cain was making every bullet count, using his intimate knowledge of weapons and angles to maximize the effectiveness of his limited ammunition. The Winchester held 15 rounds, and he had perhaps 50 more for the rifle, plus 60 rounds. For his 2 Colt .45 South against 30 men, conservation of ammunition was critical. Every shot had to disable or kill an opponent, or the inevitable outcome would arrive even sooner than mathematics suggested. The attackers quickly learned to respect the accuracy of the legendary gunfighter, taking cover behind trees and rocks as they attempted to close the distance to the cabin. Several tried to rush the building in small groups, only to be cut down by precisely placed rifle fire that demonstrated why Cain's reputation had survived 3 decades of frontier violence. Each fallen attacker reduced the odds slightly, but not quickly enough to change the ultimate outcome: burn them out. Blackwood finally commanded, frustration evident in his voice as he watched his supposedly overwhelming force being held at bay by a single defender. "Torch the cabin." Fire arrows began arcing through the darkness, their flaming points designed to ignite the dry wood of the cabin's roof and walls. Most missed their target or were extinguished by Cain's return fire, but eventually one found purchase in the roof near the chimney, and small flames began to spread across the weathered shingles. The smoke that began to fill the cabin added a new urgency to the situation. Cain could fight 30 men indefinitely if he had ammunition and cover, but he couldn't fight fire with bullets. "Lily," he called toward the root cellar. "The roof's burning. We need to move." The little girl's voice came back steady despite the terror of her situation. "Where do we go?" It was a question with no good answer. Outside the burning cabin waited 30 armed men who would show no mercy to either of them. Inside, the fire was spreading with increasing speed, filling the air with toxic smoke and threatening to turn their shelter into a death trap. Cain had perhaps 5 minutes before the situation became completely untenable. "Listen to me carefully," he said, moving toward the corner where Lily was hidden. "I'm going to open the cellar, and when I do, I want you to stay down there until I come get you, or until you're sure I'm not coming back. If I don't come back, wait until everything gets quiet, then try to make your way to the creek and follow it downstream. Eventually, you'll reach a town where there might be decent people who will help you." "What about you?" Lily asked, her voice small and frightened. "I'm going to buy you some time," Cain replied, checking his weapons one final time, "and I'm going to make sure that if these men want to hurt you, they're going to pay a price they'll never forget." He moved toward the door of the burning cabin, his mind calculating angles and distances with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of violence. 30 men were still too many to defeat in open combat, but if he could reduce their numbers significantly before the inevitable end, he might create enough confusion and fear to give Lily a chance to escape in the chaos that would follow. As Cain prepared to make his final stand, he was unaware that the sounds of battle had carried far beyond the immediate area around the line shack. The gunfire and shouting had been heard by riders approaching from the east, a column of 20 US cavalry troopers led by Captain James Morrison, who had been conducting a routine patrol along the territorial border when the sounds of combat had drawn their attention. Captain Morrison was a career soldier with 15 years of frontier experience, and he recognized the distinctive patterns of a siege when he heard them. More importantly, he was carrying federal warrants for the arrest of Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood and his known associates, wanted in connection with a series of crimes that included murder, extortion, and conspiracy against the territorial government. The cavalry patrol had been searching for Blackwood's organization for weeks, following a trail of evidence that had led them across 3 territories and finally to this remote corner of Texas. "Sergeant Walsh," Morrison called to his senior, non-commissioned officer, "deploy the men in a skirmish line. We're going to intervene in whatever's happening up ahead." "Yes, sir," Walsh replied, immediately beginning to position the troopers for combat. "What are your orders regarding prisoners?" "Colonel Blackwood and his lieutenants are wanted alive for trial," Morrison said grimly. "Everyone else, use your discretion." The cavalry's arrival changed the tactical situation dramatically. Blackwood's men, who had been focused entirely on the burning cabin and its lone defender, suddenly found themselves caught between 2 forces: Cain's deadly accurate fire from the front and a disciplined cavalry charge from the rear. The psychological impact was devastating, as men who had thought themselves part of an overwhelming force realized they were now trapped and outnumbered. "Federal cavalry," someone shouted from the darkness. "We're surrounded," Blackwood's voice cut through the chaos, trying to maintain control of his disintegrating force. "Stand and fight. We can break through if we stay together." But his men were already beginning to break and run, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the darkness. As they realized that their carefully planned operation had become a disaster, the arrival of federal troops meant that this was no longer just a local criminal enterprise, it was a federal case that would result in hangings for anyone captured alive. Captain Morrison's voice boomed across the battlefield, amplified by years of command experience. "This is the United States Cavalry. You are surrounded and ordered to surrender immediately. Throw down your weapons, and you will be treated according to military law." Inside the burning cabin, Cain heard the cavalry's arrival with a mixture of relief and wariness. Federal troops could mean salvation for Lily, but they could also mean his own arrest and execution. His reputation as a gunfighter had been built on conflicts that hadn't always aligned with official government policy. The smoke was growing, thicker by the minute, and flames were beginning to eat through the roof beams with ominous crackling sounds that spoke of imminent structural collapse. "Lily," he called toward the root cellar. "Stay down there." The cavalry's hero soldiers, not Blackwood's men. The battle outside had transformed from a siege into a rout, with Blackwood's surviving followers scattering into the darkness. Like startled rabbits, Captain Morrison's troopers pursued them with the methodical efficiency of professional soldiers, cutting off escape routes and systematically capturing or killing the members of the criminal organization that had terrorized the region for months. The sound of gunfire was becoming sporadic rather than sustained, indicating that the fight was almost over. Colonel Blackwood himself had been wounded in the initial cavalry charge, a saber cut across his left shoulder that had disabled his gun arm and left him bleeding heavily in the darkness beside Wilson Creek. His carefully planned operation had collapsed in a matter of minutes, undone by the unexpected arrival of federal forces and the stubborn resistance of a single gunfighter who had refused to abandon an innocent child. As he tried to stop the bleeding with a torn piece of his shirt, Blackwood could hear his men being rounded up by the cavalry troopers, their voices calling out surrenders and pleas for mercy. "Colonel Jeremiah Blackwood," Captain Morrison's voice carried clearly through the night air. "You are under arrest by order of the federal territorial government. Surrender now and you will be treated according to military law." Blackwood closed his eyes and felt the weight of inevitable defeat settling on his shoulders, like a burial shroud. 30 years of criminal enterprise, from the bloody battlefields of the Civil War to the lawless territories of the modern West, had finally come to an end beside a burning cabin in the middle of nowhere. He thought briefly of attempting to escape, but the wound in his shoulder, and the sounds of soldiers moving through the darkness convinced him that such efforts would be futile. "I surrender," he called out, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had finally reached the end of his violent road. "I'm wounded and unarmed." Within minutes, Sergeant Walsh and 2 troopers had located the colonel and secured him with military efficiency. As they bound his wound and prepared him for transport, Blackwood found himself staring at the burning cabin where Cain had made his impossible stand, wondering how a single man's decision to help a crying child had brought down an entire criminal empire. Inside the cabin, Cain was fighting a losing battle against the spreading fire. The smoke was making it difficult to breathe, and sections of the roof were beginning to collapse in showers of sparks and burning debris. He had perhaps 2 minutes before the structure became completely untenable, but he was reluctant to leave the relative safety of the building until he was certain that the threat to Lily had been eliminated. "Anyone in that cabin?" Captain Morrison called from outside. "This is Captain Morrison, United States Cavalry. The area is secure. Come out with your hands visible." Cain moved to the burning doorway, his Winchester rifle held ready but not pointed directly at the approaching soldiers. Through the smoke and flames, he could see uniformed troopers positioned around the clearing, their weapons trained on the cabin but not firing. These were clearly professional soldiers rather than the criminals who had been besieging them. But 30 years of survival had taught him to trust slowly and verify constantly. "I'm coming out," Cain called back. "I've got a child with me who needs medical attention." He returned to the root cellar and helped Lily climb out of her hiding place, noting how the little girl's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, but also with the kind of hope that came from hearing adult voices that didn't carry threats of violence. The cloth doll was still clutched tightly in her small hands, its worn fabric now bearing additional stains from their night of terror. "Are the bad men gone?" Lily whispered as Cain lifted her into his arms. "Yes," Cain replied with certainty. "The cavalry got them. You're safe now." They emerged from the burning cabin together, Cain's weapons visible but not threatening, his weathered face showing the strain of the night's events but also a grim satisfaction at having kept his promise to protect the child. Captain Morrison approached them slowly, his own weapon holstered as he took in the scene, a legendary gunfighter holding a small girl, both of them covered in smoke and dust but clearly alive and unharmed.